Hello and welcome to this week's video. This is the touted research workshop video, which if you remember looking at your syllabus, dates and so forth, the research workshop is actually posted. So this is a very important video, not just for this class, but also in general for researching. Excuse me, I'm gonna fix this real quick. All right. All right, that's a little bit better. Um, so so let's get started on the research workshop. Before we begin, I like to sell something to you: the importance of research and information. One of the things I'm proud of is my ability to predict future events. Please do not ask me about stock market tips or anything like that, but I'm talking about more like worldwide events or things that occur. Um, Research is such a important part of that, um, and so I've been able to successfully predict that 2016 Hillary Clinton was going to lose. I successfully the Iraq invasion and the information about it, the housing crisis. I predict that happened in um, that happened way back in 2008, the housing collapse, but I predicted that back in the late 90s, that we would see something like that in the future. So, and there's lots of other things that I predicted successfully. And a lot of that is due to just basic research and kind of reading the tea leaves when it comes to information that are out there. Because when you put things together, and you can do it through research or just general knowledge, also, you tend to be ahead of the curve. So I say this to you, and I'm trying to sell the idea of research and processing as much information as possible, because you can do actually some amazing things with it. And so that's why I do this. So before we begin that, I'll explain why research is important for your speeches, and how to use it. Remember, I said according and in are two areas to remember. So two words to remember, because when you cite and so forth. But the reason why you do that is because you want to present the best case possible. You want to present facts, so you don't sound like a conspiracy theory or something of that nature. And so the example I always use is about music, particularly modern music. And I always ask the question, who's the most influential modern music artist? Now, before I even begin that, it's important to know I have to define what modern music is. And so when I talk about this subject, I always identify it as being music that was created after the introduction of modern jazz or the guitar riffs. So essentially, the uh, birth of the blues and upbeats in jazz. Other variations of jazz. So after the beginning of the 1900s, that after that and so forth. And so the reason why I always define it, and I tell you this, is because you need to define some of your terms. So I always define it when I talk about this. So if we were in a classroom right now, I would be asking, who do you think, looking back? And there is a whole lot of artists that students have mentioned. They mentioned the Beatles, Michael Jackson. They have mentioned lots of different variations. Jimi Hendrix has been mentioned. Lots of different influential artists. And the one I always say, and the one that's the purpose of this is Little Richard. I always, every time I write this, I always don't give enough space for Richard. But Little Richard, if you don't know him, he's what we call during the oldies. Very famous for his persona and his performance, and he had a lot of big hits, including the most recognizable song would be Tutti Frutti. Go ahead and Google him. You might recognize it. We just barely lost him, and yet another casualty of 2020. But he is a very important artist and very influential. So I always ask my class, how do I prove that he's influential, the most influential artist? By the way, if you're watching this, extra credit for this section of the course is about research and opposition, and I bring this subject matter up. So pay attention not only for this video, but also for if you want to do the extra credit. So the reason why I mention this is, how do I prove that? And I have a lot of students who make suggestions, and the answer is, if I'm talking about him being a great influence on others, then I need to prove that by lots of different ways. Sampling of music is always brought up. How many people have covered his songs, and there have been quite a few. And sampling is there, but the most important quotes were would be the most important evidence of it, it would be quotes from artists. And sure enough, there is tons of interviews out there that you can look up, and that shows that Little Richard is mentioned by a bunch of artists that students have said are the most influential artists of the modern era. The Beatles, I think Paul McCartney and George Harrison and even John Lennon had quotes where they talked about him being a major influence. Then George Clinton. If you don't know who George Clinton is, him and the Parliament Funkadelic, pretty much everyone has sampled his stuff. But he's pretty much the creator of funk. Just seen recently, by the way, in the Trolls movie. And then, well, not seen, but his voice. And then finally, uh, I mentioned Elvis, and all three of those, Beatles, George Clinton, and Elvis, have mentioned Little Richard and his music and his persona and his stage performance as being major influences. And there's tons of other artists from previous eras, previous generations. Led Zeppelin comes to mind, and the Kinks, and James Brown, Johnny Cash. These are all big artists that have mentioned Little Richard. And the reason why I state this is you get these quotes from these artists, and then you show that these artists have said this, and then you get quote from modern artists who have said the Beatles and Elvis and George Clinton are major influences on their work. And by the way, just to bring up George Clinton, if you like rap or hip hop, you pretty much have to thank George Clinton in the sense of influence, especially when it comes to Dr. Dre. So that's how you would prove it. I would look up the research, credible sources with the quotes. A lot of these articles appeared in like Rolling Stone music publications and entertainment publications. And then you grow the chart from there. You go, these major artists were influenced by Little Richard, and these modern artists are influenced by these other artists. See how that works? I prove it by researching and finding the quotes. And so that's my little spiel to you on why you do it. One, you get a lot of stuff like my being able to predict things that occur, finding information, and then showing how I could prove a point, my opinion, by getting quotes and so forth. So this is all important part of the research workshop, and researching for not just this speech, but your persuasion speech and researching out. So let me show you all the different things and so forth. All right. This is shared screen. So thankfully I'm only going to be in the small little box. And let's go on with basic research. Now, it should be noted that Google and Wiki sources, for the most part, aren't used. But you can Google and find legitimate sources. But for the most part, you shouldn't be using them. And so the reason why I bring that up is because it should be noted, but more importantly, that doesn't mean you dismiss using these things for research, because it's what we consider basic research when you get the starting point. So one of the banned subjects that you have is the coronavirus. You can't do that topic. Coronavirus is off limits for your persuasion and your informative and your persuasion speeches. But it's still a great topic. So I'm going to use it for example of basic Google searches. And when I bring it up, and sure enough, I get a bunch of legitimate news sites right here that I can go from. I can get some stats, and a lot of times they also have connections to legitimate news sources. Lots of different stories and so forth. Lots of basic information that can lead you into the right direction. All right. Possible news stories to look up and so forth. And so there's a lot of basic information that you can do by with a Google search. Might not give you the exact thing that you need, but it's a starting off point. You put the terms in, and then you can go from there, and maybe even give you a better idea of how to approach your topic by what comes up first. So as we can see here, lots of different information to start off with coronavirus and so forth. But there's one thing I am looking for right now, and it's not there. So let's take a look and see if we can find it another way. And that is the wiki page. And sure enough, the COVID-19 pandemic has its own wiki page. Congratulations, COVID-19. Unfortunately, you have made it. You're on Wikipedia. And again, this is a new site this is a website you can't use. But it can't be dismissed because it can confirm information that you might already know or push you in the right direction. So for example, I've made a video where I talk about how we can, and I've actually said this to politicians, how you can compare one system to another when it comes to the United States. A lot of people say, oh, you can't compare to the United States because these countries are not like the United States. But what you can do is take one of the US states and look up the population of them and then find a country with the same kind of social economic system in the sense of development and so forth. Find the population that's similar and then compare the two. The example I always use is Iowa and Bosnia. They have a similar population. And that information was confirmed on Wiki. If I was going to cite it in a speech, I would look up a more substantial website. But like I said, it gives you a lot of basic information that can lead you to other places. And also Wiki, at the very bottom, they have references. So maybe you can't quote Wiki, but you can look up some of these references, find that they're legit, and you can quote them. Wiki and Google is a basic web source starting point. All right, so that's basic search. You use Google and you look through for legitimate websites. Now, what is non-legitimate websites? Well, an example would be biased websites. I'm not going to say who. Well, it's obvious who's biased and so forth. But when it's the best way to understand bias is when they have a purposeful agenda. You know, when they say that they're coming from a certain perspective. So you have the New York Times and Wall Street Journals, by the way, who have different kinds of editorials. You know, Wall Street Journal is famous for being a conservative, right-leaning editorial in an editorial department, but it's still a legitimate news site because overall their general purpose is reporting the news. The same thing with the New York Times and some of these publications that people yell fake news when in reality they're legitimate news sites. But biased sources are when the sources are purposefully trying to do it. So if you were looking up information for, let's say, hypothetically, a subject about a car or the car industry, if you're looking up and you want information on Toyota, if you go to a Toyota website, by the way, don't buy Toyotas. Um, the thing is, their website would be considered biased. And same thing with political sites. You know, you might find actual news stories on Fox News, but Fox News is a great example of dedicated media where it's dedicated to one perspective, a conservative perspective. And you need to be careful on news sites because there's journalism and then there's opinion. Opinion pieces are biased in nature. It could be in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, or whatever, but opinion is biased in nature. So you have to be aware of those things. Okay, so avoid biased websites. The classic example coming from my high school days was every year it was reported the most stolen car or the easiest car to steal. And during that time, it was a Honda. It was a Honda, and Honda is usually on the top of that list every year. But that news information was coming from Detroit, home of U.S. automakers. So keep that in mind when you are looking to avoid bias sites. And also you have to be unreliable. So I use this example, irs.gov. irs.gov is the official website for the our IRS. But if you go to irs.com, it is a example. It is actually a private business who, before the IRS got their stuff together for a website, they pretty much squatted on it. So you have to always be careful. And web addresses, especially the last three letters or last two letters of it, is a good indicator. Now, ironically enough, .com, and I use the IRS as an example, is actually usually the most reliable. Um, when you're looking at the most reliable website, .com is considered the most reliable of those last letters of the web address. .com has been around since the beginning of the internet. By the way, fun fact, when the internet first started before Google and it was like Yahoo search and so forth, for search engines, they would use the most frequently said word to say what the website was about. So for many years, or at least 1 year, the number one website for Disneyland, or the number two website for Disneyland, was a website dedicated to serial killers, because the person who created it, in the background, it was Disneyland over and over again, but in invisible lettering, because it was a white background with white letters. And so that's how they got to number one. So it's important to understand the web address. So the most reliable, because it's the most established, is .com. You IRS is an outlier, but for the most part, major organizations and celebrities and so forth, they own that, and then they'll have the other lesser sites. Then you go with .org or .gov would probably be the next layer, the next level of established websites, and then .edu would be up there too. So, what is considered the most unreliable one? Well, it's important to know, for hint hint a test, the most unreliable one would be .net. .net is the new one. I know there's a whole bunch of them that have been created, but the reason why .net is still considered the most unreliable, because out of the majors, the .com, the .org, the .edu, .gov, .net is the newest of them and considered the most unreliable. So .net is the most unreliable. The other one that is the most suspicious is the country prefixes. Every country, those last letters, the initial of the country. So for us, it would be in the United States, .us would be any website. And by the way, I was seeing congressional candidates that are using .us instead of .com now, and these are considered the most, because the country of origin, the country of it, is pretty much in charge of those letter addresses. So like Mexico, I believe, is .mx, Germany .de, Great Britain, I think, is .gb, and so forth. It goes, Canada's, I believe, .ca. So these are how these countries work. The reason why it's considered unreliable is there is a whole lot of countries that let things go. So there's a lot of the island countries and countries in Asia, some African countries, but specifically in Asia and the islands, Pacific Islands. There's some countries that's where all the streaming websites, they use their letters. So again, basic web searches are great to get you started, but you have to make sure when you go down that path, you avoid biased websites and unreliable websites. But what is the most reliable? Well, that is what we call the advanced search. So, for example, I'm at our school website in East Los Angeles College. You get over there and you look at all the possibilities. Let's see, register, explore, menu, go to menu, and sure enough, there's the library. And when you go onto the library website, by the way, you can pass some of these clicks by just typing in Google search ELAC library databases. But sure enough, you come over here and you look at the options, find books, media, find articles, and poof, right there, databases. Um, by the way, over here, the most popular databases are the ones that are the best ones for you, especially starting out as researchers. But EBSCO is a popular, I believe is the best one for just starting out. An academic search complete also. Unfortunately, my information is not downloaded with ELAC, so I have to use another website for their database. I'm using one from a public library to get started. So remember earlier I said about predictions and so forth. Well, one of the things that I predicted a long time ago before it had occurred, and this was in the mid 90s when I was just starting off in college, but I predicted gentrification. I predicted gentrification was going to happen eventually because as a kid, and I loved watching the news as in my teens because I got active in politics early. I remember watching stories and also reading articles about the commuter lifestyle and kids who grew up. And as somebody who had working parents who were never home, I can tell you if you grew up that way, especially with commuters who would leave the house like 5 in the morning and not get back till late at night, their kids probably recognized it. So I predicted a long time ago that those kids, the those the kids of those parents, commuter parents, will eventually move back. So if I was doing an article search here in EBSCO and looking for journals and so forth. Now, by the way, this is a public library website, so I might not get the best results comparative to yours. But I would put gentrification as one of the search engine. And by the way, it suggests a bunch of other things. Like you can narrow it down to Los Angeles and so forth. You can come down here and add a term. And I put commute. And so if I wanted to look up and see maybe if I was going to do a paper or a speech about that prediction I had way back in the 90s about gentrification occurring. By the way, I didn't use gentrification back there. I just said that the kids because I didn't know what gentrification was, but I knew that these kids were not going to have the same lifestyle as their parents. I can maybe start looking up searches using gentrification and commute as two terms, two separate terms. In Google searches, you tend to put it all on the one line, but by doing it here with different lines, you can do things like this. Now, again, this is a library website, so I only got one article. I'm sure if this was something different, but you can see here, you can start it off. Let's do a more common one. Depression is a popular subject for students to do speeches on. So let's just do depression. So I'll look up articles. Again, this is a public library, so I might not get that many. See, I got 4,000 this time. All right. So let's say you wanted to do that search, you put in depression and you have to narrow the searches. And let's say you wanted to do college students and depression as an example. You just type it in the second line and then you narrow down the searches for college students and depression. And this is like any other search engine where you can look up and have variations. So for example, I have a lot of students who will look up do speeches, but they don't want to do it from the United States perspective. They wanted to do it from somewhere else. So you just type in United States with the word not. You do the searches, and boom, you get a bunch of articles about different the issue of depression about college students that are the article is not focused on the United States. And you go down the list and there's a bunch of different things. You can come over here, and if you were doing you wanted to have a different search, you can go with you only want journals. You have a professor who just wants academic journals. You can narrow the searches that way. You can also narrow the searches. Let's say you wanted a current one. Journals take a while. Their papers take a while for the research and everything to be done. So you can narrow it down to magazines and news for more periodical type things. Lots of different things. You can do publication date. If you do like me, I tend to only want articles and journal reports from the last 5 to 8 years. It's my 5 to 8 rule. Then I can narrow it down and just, -8. Just kidding. And you can see I can narrow it down if I wanted to. And I have, the same amount of searches. You see how this works, all right? Now so that's the advanced search, where you have EBSCO and you just put in the terms in any way you want. Let's click on one of these things. But by the way, before you click on it, a lot of times the initial information will tell you whether or not they actually have the article, which is usually over here. And then it gives you an abstract of what the article is about. But I wanted to point out one other thing before we're done here about advanced searches. All right. There's citation right here. You go to citation, and a lot of times the citation is done for you. That's why I say always use EBSCO and Academic Search Complete for your searches, because they do you can copy and paste the citation right here, American Psychological Association, APA. All right. And by the way, there's another way. Let me get out of this real quick. There's another way you can cite. You can just Google APA citation, and you can look it up, and you can add things like if you're looking for in book site, how to cite a book, how to do it in text or in paper or in PowerPoint, how to do it in the actual paper. You can cheat and you can look up images, and a lot of times they'll just have the image right there. So this is how you look up what kind of citation you use. You can find it through the database, like I showed you with citation. Oops. Come over here. And they can actually do the citation for you. There's citation generators online, lots of different things. All right. So this is the basics, the introduction to research. Remember earlier I said about the Little Richard. If I wanted to look up Little Richard quotes, I put Little Richard and then Beatles, for example. If I wanted to do the prediction, and I had a feeling for years that the housing crisis, the site, I told you the gentrification. Back when I was a teenager, I initially thought that idea because I watched a news story about the commuter lifestyle and on parents and so forth. When I predicted the housing crisis back in 2000, it was because there was a Marine that did loans for cars that talked about how houses were now the new thing after the tech bubble to do that, and told me some things that made me very skeptical of it. And so I looked up and researched about it, and sure enough, I said, "Oh, okay. Well, we're gonna have a big burst, and it's gonna be worse." No, I wasn't trying to rhyme there, and I did that by doing Google and database searches back in the day. All right. So lots of different ways to do that. If you have questions on research, you can always go to my office hours and so forth. The last thing I want to leave you with before I give you the discussion participation is this website, CIA World Factbook. You just have to Google CIA World Factbook. It'll come up right away. There's a lot of websites that are great just for basic knowledge. And this is, I think, the best one. If you're doing anything about what's happening in a country or anything of that nature, you can get a lot of basic information on it. You just look up the country and when you hit the World Factbook. And our government and the CIA has made this public. They collect all this data about different countries. And by the way, you'll be surprised, a lot of information, basic information for your local areas is on different websites as well. But so for example, CIA World Factbook, I happen to click Argentina. If I come down here, I get a lot of basic information on the country that I'm talking about, or where the issue is occurring. And CIA World Factbook with all this information is citable. Wikipedia is not. Basic Google searches that lead you to, basic websites are not. But the CIA World Factbook, where a lot of that basic information that you find on Wiki, CIA World Factbook is citable. It is a legit website that you can cite. All right. Okay. Below in the discussion participation, you're coming up with your first speech. I want to see one of your research facts. You just state the fact that you're going to do, and if you write the citation for it below. So just a sentence of the fact, cite what you're supposed to do in APA, and then have the official citation. By the way, I'm not asking you to do anything extra really, because you're supposed to be doing this for your paper. This is 5 easy participation points by just taking the information that you're getting from your outline and posting it in the discussion thread. Pretty easy one today. This video is something you might look at more than once because, again, it goes over the basics on research. All right. Any questions, office hours, and through Canvas, as always. All right. Have a good day, and hopefully I can finally get some sleep.